here, and okay. So I'm sorry that you weren't able to hear that as clearly as I would have liked you to. Are you hearing me now?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, and it's a great video. I obviously, when we practiced, I saw that.
I don't know why you couldn't hear it. We practiced it and you could hear it fine.
Yeah.
So the two people who are really speaking there about election security are Alex Halderman. He's a professor of computer scientist at the University of Michigan. And then the big beefy guy in the white shirt, that's James Scott. He's a fellow with the ICIT, that's the Critical Infrastructure Technology. And James Scott and the people at ICIT were actually hired by HPE, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, to try and hack an election. And they didn't have any trouble. They were asked to write a report, and their report is called Hacking Elections is Easy. So one of the things that James Scott said in that briefing that isn't in the video, he said that election results will be for sale in 2020. He called it access as a service. And what that means is that a hacker gets into a machine and keeps a back door open and then sells access to that machine or those machines for a fee. And he said, it's not a possibility. He said it's definite. This quote, access as a service will be available. And then the other thing that he did talk about that in the video that I guess you had a hard time hearing, but he talked about fractional voting. And fractional voting is basically when you vote and I vote, but my vote might count for 1.5 and your vote might only count for half of a vote, like. And in that way, you can see that my candidate would have a much easier time winning. And this is, again, a technology that already exists and can be utilized and possibly will be utilized in the next election. And then
instead of gerrymandering.
Another concern that we've got is in terms of accuracy. In the Wisconsin recount that Bob was talking about, there was a study that was done out of MIT and Harvard. And it said that 1 out of every 170 ballots in 2016, this was in Wisconsin, was miscounted in the election night tabulation. That's the count that was certified. So we really have an accuracy problem and we have a security problem. So what are we going to do? We need to vote on paper. And we need to count the paper. There are only 2 states currently conducting audits that are robust enough to detect cyber attacks. That's again J. Alex Halderman, who you saw in the video. Right now, the audits that are being done are what's called flat percentage audits. In California, we're auditing 1% of the ballot by hand. That means that those ballots are actually counted manually. Someone looks at them, but it's only 1% of the ballots. In New York, they manually count 3%. The problem is that computer scientists and statisticians have said that those flat percent audits are not adequate to determine whether or not the votes are being counted accurately. They would not actually detect a cyber attack or a miscount. So we need to move to different kinds of audits. One solution is 100% hand-counted paper ballot audit. And I think many people are familiar with what that means. It basically means you run the machine, you run the ballot through a scanner, but then following that, with good chain of custody, you count the ballots 100% by hand and compare the results. There is not a huge movement right now for 100% hand-counted paper ballots. I'll tell you that most of the election officials that I talk to dread them. They don't like them. And the one place where they really are doing them is in Columbia County, New York, and they're doing them very successful there. very successfully. But it is a small county. So that's one of the reasons that my proposal is that we do hand counting in smaller counties, and in large counties, we move to risk-limiting audits. Risk-limiting audits are kind of a big buzzword right now. If you read any of the reports, like the Brennan Center report, you'll hear them talking about risk-limiting audits, but very few people really understand what they are. So I want to spend a little time talking about what are risk-limiting audits and what are the advantages and disadvantages. Are you guys, I just want to check in and see, are you guys hearing me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So we can do questions on this afterwards. Risk-limiting audits are complicated. They were developed and promoted in large part by Phil Stark. He's a professor of statistics at the University of California, Berkeley. And this is from their first white paper. A risk-limiting audit checks some voted ballots in search of strong evidence that the reported election outcome was correct, if it was. So basically, instead of counting all the ballots by hand, you're taking a statistical formula and you're determining a certain number of ballots that need to be counted by hand in order to have a strong confidence. It might be 95, 98, 99% confidence that the outcome of the election is correct. And then you compare certain ballots to make that assessment. And if those ballots do not come out correctly, then you escalate the audit and you count more ballots by hand, or you count all the ballots by hand. So I support risk-limiting audits. I think that they're a good idea. They've been implemented now in Colorado, and they've done some pilot elections there, and they're starting to implement them statewide. And then I think the other state that they're doing them in is in New Mexico. But I also have reservations about them. They're complex, they have security issues, and in some cases, they might not be transparent. And I'm going to go into each of these in a little bit more detail. So in terms of complexity, can you guys see this slide?
Yes.
Okay.
I remember that.
This is one of the formulas to determine whether or not an audit can stop. And it's complicated. I'm going to say that unless somebody has advanced mathematical training, they're probably not going to understand the details of how a risk-limiting audit works. And there's also a whole vocabulary that Phil has introduced. It includes diluted margins, pairwise margins, understatements, overstatements. There's a whole vocabulary that has to be mastered in order to understand how these audits work. So what happens when an audit is so complex that the vast majority of the public and possibly even election officials may not understand how it works? Well, they might do it incorrectly, thinking that they're doing it right. They might know they're doing it wrong, but they might not want to ask because they don't want to look stupid. They might pretend to do it, but not actually do it correctly. So the audit involves finding very specific ballots that are randomly chosen and then comparing those specific ballots to the outcome of the voting machine. How did the voting machine count those ballots? But if you just pick some other ballots, you wouldn't actually be doing the audit correctly. And it might be possible for officials to game that audit and do a fraudulent audit because the voters may not understand how the audit works. And we do have experience of election officials gaming audits. That is what happened in Idaho County in 2004. We had election officials that were actually convicted of doing the audit ahead of time because they wanted to make sure it came out a certain way, and they got a conviction for that. So we know that election officials sometimes do game audits. In terms of security, because the audits are so complex, the way that they may be implemented, and in fact in Colorado, they are being implemented with software. So Colorado has hired a company called Free and Fair, and Free and Fair has developed a whole software system that basically does the risk limiting audit, implements the risk limiting audit, and and then the state can use this software in order to determine the formulas, in order to figure out which ballots need to be examined. And so the problem here is that now you have software checking software. So now we have security issues again, because if the software of the voting machines can be hacked, if someone is sophisticated enough of a hacker to hack the voting machines, it's also possible they're sophisticated enough to hack the audit. So we have security issues there, and they have transparency issues. It's unclear if the election officials are actually going to be willing to release all of the documents that would be necessary for the public to know if the audit is being conducted correctly. One key document that needs to be released is called the cast vote record file. That isn't something that people talk about a lot, but it's actually a really important document that has all the results of the election, like every single machine. It shows how each vote was handled. But in Colorado, the election officials are saying they may not want to release the cast vote record file because it may violate voters' privacy. If you don't have access to that cast vote record file, it basically is impossible for the public to check if the risk limiting audit was done successfully. So my proposal is that we create basically a two-tier system. And because there isn't a real movement for hand-counted paper ballots in all counties, we try to do hand-counted paper ballots where it's possible, where they could be done. And based on conversations that I've had, primarily with Virginia Martin, who is the election commissioner in Columbia County, where they do hand-counted paper ballots, and other election officials that I've talked to, I made a proposal that we have small, limited designations and large, complex designations. So a small designation would mean a county or a jurisdiction with on average 50,000 ballots or less, or 10 or fewer referendums. And those counties would do a 100% hand count audit. Virginia Martin has said that they would be able to do 50,000 ballots comfortably. They've done, I think, up to 65,000 ballots comfortably. They've done 7 referendums comfortably. So this is kind of ballpark of something that's actually happening now. We have other counties, but LA County. LA County has over 3 million ballots in 2016, and they had over 70 referendums. That's a county that's going to have a hard time counting 100% of the ballot by hand. So in a county like LA County or other counties with a lot of referendums, the recommendation is that we would do risk limiting audits with a 99% confidence rate, but we could also add in a few things to boost our confidence that the race is counted accurately. We could do 100% hand count audits of one randomly drawn race and 100% hand count audits of any race that's close. Say the margin of victory is less than 1%. I also just briefly want to talk about some advances that we've added in hand count. There are established protocols for hand counting the ballots that involve multiple individuals looking at a ballot and it being done in public with transparency to the media. But there's other techniques we can use that can complement this. So in Wisconsin, they explored something called slideshow counting. And that's where the ballot is projected very large on the wall with a ballot, like with a tape projector. And then they count the ballots in batches of 25. And that actually goes very quickly. There's also a whole group of people led by John Brakey who are working on releasing photographic ballot images to the public. This is something that Bob touched on briefly. He said that the election officials are turning the switch off. And what he's talking about is the switch that allows the machine to make a photographic ballot image. Most of the scanners in use, the modern scanners, not the old legacy scanners, but the modern scanners have the ability to make an image of the ballot. And in fact, that's how they count the ballot, is by making that image. And if we release those images to the public, then the public can count the ballots as well, and we can have more confidence. And then there's a few other ways. There's groups that are working with spreadsheets that have made hand counts easier. And there's also exploration being done about better ballot design. So I just want to leave you with a statement. This is my passionate belief. There is currently no single more important task for the United States elections community than to get meaningful audits in place prior to the 2018 elections. Thank you so much.
I know there will be questions afterward.
Great.
Next up is Adam Friedman.
No, it's all right. Sorry, folks. I guess I'll start gabbing, doing all this. Thanks for having me, Paul. Can I reveal your true identity in terms of Massachusetts voter choice?
It's out.
Your loyalties. It's out.
I'm out.
Oh, it's too late because I'm saying all that out loud. All right. Yeah, so Paul is a member of Voter Choice Massachusetts. As I mentioned before, with the statewide movement for ranked choice voting, and I want to talk to you folks about that. So raise your hand if you've heard of instant runoff voting or ranked choice voting. Raise your hand real high so I know what we're dealing with here.
Oh.
Very good. All right, raise your hand if instant runoff voting is the term you know it by. Oh, good. Okay. The branding kind of changeover has been working. So we've changed. So it used to be called instant runoff voting. Folks, advocates in the, around the country have started calling it ranked choice voting. For the reason I think is just not as wonky. It's more about the voters' experience at the ballot, rather than this notion of an instant runoff, which is about the way that it is tabulated. But in terms of the relevance of this reform, it's just kind of another way to get at a question of integrity of the vote, and does my vote count? I guess Lulu will be joining us for the talk. Let me see if this...
Oh, she's still there.
Okay, so